All right, plenty to get across. Joining me now, National Editor at The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. I haven't seen you since you came back from Italy. Dennis, delighted to have you on the program as always. I want to go north to Queensland. There's talk about the Queensland Treaty with Aboriginal Australians, excuse me, today. There's talk it'll cost hundreds of millions of dollars, about 150 different tribes, they call them now First Nations in Queensland. Every one of them will have a reparations deal. Some of that detail's out there, certainly the number amount is out there. We've seen this happen, of course, in New Zealand. The benchmark over there was tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. There's 80 settlements or so in New Zealand. As I said, 150 in Queensland, more in other states. We're not even getting to the voice. There'll be supplementary deals at a Commonwealth level. Supposing the voice gets up at the end of the year, there'll be the truth-telling and everything that comes from that. Surely this sort of information, this sort of detail coming out that's a lot more concrete than we're getting from the Prime Minister will cause people to maybe think twice about what a vote for the voice actually means in practice.
Well, I think that if I was a supporter of the voice, as the Prime Minister is, I wouldn't be too happy about Queensland leading away and talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in reparations, because they are separate issues. The treaty in Queensland, the voice in South Australia, the First Nations in Victoria, they're all different to the federal voice, but they are all coming together. And what we're seeing is that Queensland is saying that they will be the benchmark for negotiations on a treaty and on reparations. Now, reparations has always been a big sticking point with people. They are suspicious that the voice is all about reparations. And when they see Queensland ministers talking about hundreds of millions of dollars just in Queensland, and with 150 various groups in Queensland, in New Zealand, it's different. They have had a treaty for almost 200 years. They have representatives in the Parliament, Maori representatives, but also in New Zealand, the Maori are virtually and effectively in control of water control. Now, do we want in Australia Aboriginal groups, First Nations groups, actually buying into the Murray-Darling Basin, which has already got state governments, territory governments and federal governments fighting for years over that? So this idea that Queensland is going to lead the way with a Canadian or New Zealand-style co-governance and reparations, I think is very bad news for the voice to Parliament advocates. And we've seen this week the parliamentary committee, of course, dominated by Labor, saying that executive government must be included so that the whole new chapter of the Constitution, if the referendum passes, will deal with executive government in exactly the way from day-to-day decisions from the Barrier Reef to the Reserve Bank. Now, I think that the disclosures in Queensland, in the Australian today, are a very sobering thought and a bit of a break on support for the federal voice to Parliament and executive government.
And people like me who oppose the voice for a range of reasons, not least this one, have got a big job ahead of us to get that message out. I agree with you. I think once Australians understand this, that position's going to harden to a no. The question is, are enough going to understand it before they vote, as we think will be likely in October? Let's talk about news poll today. Only 13% actually think this budget's going to improve the economy. 39% say it'll make inflation worse. Now, voters aren't stupid, Dennis. You give people handouts, they know it's going to make spending increase, and spending increases, there goes inflation. And of course, at the back end of all of that, you force the RBA into jacking up rates again. Any wonder this budget's struggling?
Well, look, I think if you look at the news poll numbers, it's pretty clear, and it is actually understandable. Of course, a small number of people say that they think they'll be personally better off because only a small number of people are better off as a result of the budget. Of course, the government is trying to address Middle Australia because Middle Australia got very little out of this budget. And so on a simple basis, that simple question of are you better off as a result of the budget, which is what Peter Dutton asked in his budget and reply, people are saying, no, we're not, or it makes no difference. On the key political question, and I did mention this in your absence last week, Peter, that there was a danger for the government that by bleeding out and announcing all of the good news about all of the help it was giving on cost of living to people who needed it most, quite legitimately, no choice, they had to do it. Jim Chalmers had to give out billions because of the promises the government had made. The key question then became on budget night, is it inflationary or not? And of course, that then became the argument for last week, and the news poll demonstrates that a majority of people either think it has not helped inflation or it has made it worse. And so the government is now in a position, and we've seen that today with the Middle Australia rhetoric, another line from Peter Dutton's budget in reply speech talking about Middle Australia being forgotten and left behind. So the government now has two major political problems. It's got to convince Middle Australia that it will help them in cost of living relief, as well as those who deserved it most. And it also now has to try and argue, as Anthony Albanese said, that the budget was deflationary. Now, the Reserve Bank only has to keep interest rates a bit higher, or as high, for a bit longer, and this budget will have been deemed to have failed. The government has a major problem in its post-budget sales pitch and people's reaction to it. It was predictable, but it was also interesting to see that Anthony Albanese today, when talking about the news poll, started talking about the news polls over the last 10 years. Now, this is quite a big
I did notice
departure
that.
for a Prime Minister, because normally they just say, I'm not a commentator, I don't talk about the polls, polls come and go, they don't... Instead, Anthony Albanese tried to use the history of news poll over a long period of time to say, this budget was actually in the middle band. That was a bad sign that Anthony Albanese has felt the need to have to engage with the news poll results.
100%.
Which tells you those
100%.
news poll results are exactly what he's been told from his own pollsters.
He's had the pollsters in over the weekend. Look at that language change. We'll see what happens when they're out selling it this week. This is the week, I'm telling my viewers, you know this, Dennis, where they contest the narrative. Both sides are trying to get their line up on the budget. It looks like the government, their line is in trouble, hence the Middle Australia stuff. But we'll get a sense of the tone, particularly amongst colleagues on the backbench, how the budget's been received when Parliament comes back next week, and we'll see what heat the Prime Minister and the Treasurer gets